January 18th, 1943. Dawn breaks over Bougainville Island. The sky above the Solomon Sea burns copper and gold, a canvas stretched between darkness and day. In the cockpit of a Mitsubishi, a 6M0, Lieutenant Hiroshi Nishizawa adjusts his goggles against the glare. Below him, the jungle canopy rolls endless and green, broken only by the silver thread of a river cutting toward the coast. The air at 12,000 feet is thin and cold, but Nishizawa doesn't feel it. He feels only the familiar weight of certainty, the knowledge that he flies the finest fighter aircraft the world has ever known, piloted by warriors whose skill has been honed through blood and victory across half the Pacific. He does not yet know that in less than 4 months, a machine he has never seen will rewrite the mathematics of aerial combat. He does not know that American engineers, working in secrecy 3,000 miles away, have already solved the equation that will break the back of Japanese air superiority. He does not know that the P-38 Lightning is coming, and that when it arrives, men like him, the best Japan has, will fall from the sky like burning leaves. But on this morning, as the sun climbs and the patrol continues, Nishizawa believes what every pilot in the Imperial Japanese Navy believes: that American fighters are inferior, their pilots soft, their industrial might wasted on machines built by a democracy too comfortable to understand war. This belief will not survive the year. To understand how deeply this conviction ran through the Japanese military mind, one must return to December 1941, to the moment when American air power first met Japanese steel over Pearl Harbor and the Philippines. The pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy arrived in those skies with a weapon that defied Western engineering philosophy: the Zero fighter, a machine so light and maneuverable it seemed to mock the laws of physics. Weighing barely 4,000 pounds empty, powered by a Sakai radial engine that sang at 2,800 revolutions per minute, the Zero could turn inside any American fighter, climb faster, and fly farther than intelligence reports had deemed possible. In the Philippines, American P-40 Warhawks fell in flames. Over Java, British Hurricanes were shredded. In Burma, the vaunted Royal Air Force learned that their tactics, forged in the skies over Britain, meant nothing against an enemy who could loop and roll as if gravity itself had bent to their will. By the spring of 1942, the Zero had achieved something close to mythological status, not just among the Americans who faced it, but among the Japanese who flew it. Kill ratios in those early months ran as high as 12-1. Entire squadrons were annihilated. Pilots who survived combat reported an enemy aircraft that seemed impossible, a fighter that violated every assumption about the trade-offs between speed, range, and agility. And so the belief hardened into doctrine. American fighters were inferior because American philosophy was inferior. The United States built heavy, armored machines for pilots who valued survival over victory. They prized firepower over finesse, protection over performance. Their aircraft carried self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plate behind the cockpit, redundant systems, luxuries that added weight and sapped maneuverability. The Zero carried none of these things. A single incendiary round in the right place could turn it into a fireball. But this was acceptable. The pilot's skill, his spirit, his willingness to die, these were the armor. A warrior did not need steel, he needed only courage and the finest blade. This philosophy was not arrogance. It was the product of culture, of necessity, of Japan's industrial reality. The island nation lacked the aluminum, the oil, the sprawling factories of its enemy. Every pound of weight removed from an aircraft was a victory over scarcity. Every gallon of fuel saved extended range across an ocean empire that stretched from the Aleutians to the edge of India. The Zero was not merely a fighter. It was a distillation of Japanese strategic thought, a weapon designed for an empire that could not afford waste. And in the beginning, it worked. The Americans died in droves. Their tactics were predictable, their aircraft slow and clumsy in a turning fight. The F-4F Wildcat, the primary carrier fighter in 1942, was a stubby, brutish machine that could neither outrun nor outmaneuver the Zero. Its pilots survived only by adhering to rigid discipline. Never dogfight, never turn. Attack from altitude and dive away. Even then, the losses mounted. At Coral Sea, at Midway, at Guadalcanal, American pilots learned to fear the Zero's silhouette. Those elliptical wings, that greenhouse canopy, the red circle painted on the fuselage like a rising sun. But the Japanese pilots did not see the other half of the equation. They did not see the factories rising in Detroit and Seattle and Los Angeles, vast cathedral-like structures where women in coveralls riveted aluminum and men in shirt sleeves calculated stress loads, and engineers worked through the night-solving problems that Japanese industry would never have the resources to address. They did not see the design boards at Lockheed's Burbank plant, where a team led by Clarence Kelly Johnson was creating something unprecedented. A twin-engine, twin-boom fighter that would render every assumption about aerial combat obsolete. The Americans had learned. They had bled. And they had learned. And they were building something terrible. The P-38 Lightning did not look like a fighter. It looked like a mistake, a fever dream, a sculptor's unfinished sketch. Two engines mounted on booms, a central nacelle housing the cockpit and nose armament, a horizontal stabilizer connecting the booms like a bridge suspended in air. Pilots, who first saw it, called it the fork-tailed devil, the flying cigar tube, the ungainly duckling. It weighed more than twice what a Zero weighed. It was enormous, complex, expensive, everything Japanese design philosophy said a fighter should not be. But it was fast. Faster than anything in the Pacific sky. At 25,000 feet, a P-38 could reach 414 miles per hour in level flight, a speed no Zero could match even in a dive. Its twin Allison V1710 engines, each producing more than 1,000 horsepower, drove it through the air with a sustained fury that transformed speed from a tactical advantage into a strategic weapon. And unlike the fragile Zero, the Lightning could take punishment. Its twin engines meant redundancy. Lose one, and a skilled pilot could still fly home. Its armor plate and self-sealing tanks meant survival. Its centralized armament, 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20-millimeter cannon clustered in the nose, meant devastating accuracy. No convergence issues, no wing-mounted guns that lost effectiveness with range. The P-38 pointed its nose at a target and unleashed a cone of destruction that could saw a Zero in half. But more than its specifications, more than its speed or firepower, the P-38 represented a philosophical counter-argument. It said that technology could overcome spirit, that industrial capacity could defeat elan, that a democracy of engineers and factory workers could build a weapon superior to anything created by a warrior culture. It said that the American way of war, methodical, resource-intensive, technologically sophisticated, was not a weakness, but a strength. The Japanese would learn this lesson in blood. The Lightning entered combat in the Pacific Theater in late 1942, initially in small numbers, flown by pilots still learning its quirks and capabilities. It was not an easy aircraft to master. The twin engines required constant attention, the controls were heavy, and the high-altitude performance came with a price. compressibility issues in high-speed dives that could lock the controls and send the aircraft tumbling. Early encounters were inconclusive. The Zero pilots, veterans of 100 combats, exploited every mistake, punished every hesitation. They had expected the Americans to field a new fighter, and they had expected it to be inadequate. But then, April 18, 1943 arrived. Operation Vengeance. Intelligence intercepts revealed that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and commander of the combined fleet, would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville on an inspection tour. His transport would be escorted by Zeros. The route was known, the timing precise, and the Americans had the one aircraft that could fly the distance, execute the intercept, and fight its way home. 16 P-38 Lightnings launched from Guadalcanal, flying at wave-top height to avoid radar detection, navigating by dead reckoning across 435 miles of empty ocean. The fuel margins were razor-thin. Any combat would have to be brief. But the Lightning's range made the mission possible. No other American fighter could have flown it. At 0934 hours, the Lightnings climbed and intercepted Yamamoto's flight precisely where intelligence had predicted. The Zeros, caught by surprise, fought with the desperation of men who understood what failure meant. But they were outnumbered, and more critically, they were outmatched. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber dove on the transport bombers. Barber's P-38 fired, and Yamamoto's Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bomber staggered, trailing smoke, and plunged into the jungle. The escort Zeros attempted to intervene, but the covering Lightnings met them at speed, and speed was everything. The P-38s could engage or disengage at will. They could dive away from trouble faster than the Zeros could follow. They dictated the terms of combat, and those terms were brutal. 3 Zeros went down. 1 P-38 was lost. The Americans turned for home, their fuel gauges reading near empty, and behind them, the jungle burned where Japan's greatest naval strategist had died. The psychological impact was seismic. Yamamoto was irreplaceable, a strategic mind whose understanding of America had made him both advocate for avoiding war and the architect of Japan's early victories. His death was a propaganda disaster, a strategic decapitation, and a demonstration that the Americans could reach anywhere, strike anyone, and return safely. But more than that, it was proof that the P-38 Lightning was not just another fighter. It was a weapon that changed the geometry of the Pacific War. Through the summer and fall of 1943, the Lightning killed the best pilots Japan had. It killed them not through superior skill, though American training was improving, but through superior performance. The mathematics were simple and inescapable. In a turning fight, the Zero still held advantages, but the P-38 never had to turn. It could boom and zoom, diving from altitude with the sun at its back, firing a burst, and climbing away before the Zeros could react. It could run down bombers that no Zero could catch. It could escort bombers to targets the Japanese had thought unreachable. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Bong, America's top ace, flew a P-38. He claimed 40 confirmed kills, almost all in the Southwest Pacific, hunting across New Guinea and the Philippines. His tactics were textbook Lightning doctrine: altitude, speed, a single firing pass, and escape. He did not dogfight. He did not need to. Major Thomas Maguire, who scored 38 kills, flew the same way. Captain Robert Westbrook, Captain Edward Cragg, a generation of American pilots learned that the P-38 allowed them to fight the war on their terms, not the enemy's. And the Japanese pilots, even the aces, even the veterans, began to die. Not all at once, not in a single catastrophic battle, but steadily, inexorably, as the weight of American production and the superiority of American technology ground them down. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest aces with 64 kills, survived the war, but wrote afterward with bitter clarity. The appearance of the P-38 changed everything. We could no longer dictate the combat. They engaged when they wished and broke off when they wished. Our advantages meant nothing if we could not force them to fight. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, the ace who had greeted the dawn over Bougainville in January, continued flying through 1943 and into 1944. He accumulated kills, becoming one of Japan's most decorated pilots, credited with over 80 victories. But the sky around him emptied of friendly aircraft. The experienced pilots died or were reassigned. Replacements arrived with a fraction of the training. Boys barely out of adolescence who had logged 50 hours in obsolete trainers and were thrust into combat against Americans flying 400 hours before they saw an enemy. Nishizawa himself was not shot down by a fighter. He died in October 1944, a passenger in a transport aircraft that was strafed on the ground in the Philippines. Killed by the weight of American air superiority he had fought against for 2 years. There is a photograph, preserved in the National Archives, taken at an airfield on Guadalcanal in late 1943. In the foreground, a P-38 Lightning sits with its engines silent, the twin booms casting long shadows in the afternoon light. The nose art reads, Marge, a woman's name painted in white script, personal and intimate. Beside the aircraft, a crew chief in grease-stained coveralls works on the cowling of one engine. In the background, barely visible, a captured Zero sits behind barbed wire, its paint faded, its frame crumpled where it was forced down in a rice paddy. The contrast is everything. The Lightning is immaculate, maintained, part of a logistical chain that stretches back to California, a chain that delivers spare parts, mechanics, fuel, ammunition, replacement aircraft. The Zero is abandoned, a relic, unrepairable because no parts exist, no supply line functions, no factory can replace what has been lost. The photograph captures, more eloquently than words, the fundamental asymmetry of the Pacific War. By 1943, Japan had built a magnificent fighter and trained superb pilots, but they could not replace either. America could replace everything. Every pilot lost was succeeded by another, better trained. Every aircraft lost rolled off a production line that built more Lightnings in a month than Japan built Zeros in a year. The symbolic weight of the P-38 became, in this sense, larger than its tactical contributions. It represented the industrial juggernaut behind it, the democracy that could mobilize resources on a scale Japan could not comprehend. It was not merely a machine, it was a messenger, carrying a brutal truth across the Pacific sky. That spirit and skill, courage and tradition could not overcome steel and oil and aluminum when the steel and oil and aluminum arrived in infinite quantity, shaped by engineers who understood that war was a problem to be solved through technology and production. The Japanese leadership had believed American fighters were inferior because they believed American culture was inferior. Democracies were soft, individualistic, incapable of the collective sacrifice required for total war. The soldiers would not fight, the factories would not produce, the people would crumble under pressure. This belief was not irrational. It was based on observation of Western colonial decay, on the assumption that the United States, having not fought a major war in a generation, had lost the capacity for sustained violence. The attack on Pearl Harbor was designed to shatter American will, to force a negotiated peace before industrial might could be mobilized. But the P-38 Lightning and the thousands of aircraft like it proved the assessment catastrophically wrong. The United States did not crumble. It mobilized. And its mobilization was not the desperate, all-consuming effort of a nation stripped of choice, but the methodical, overwhelming application of an economy so vast it could fight a two-ocean war, while its civilian population enjoyed luxuries Japanese soldiers could not imagine. American pilots in the Pacific ate hot meals, received mail from home, watched movies between missions. They flew aircraft maintained by trained mechanics using standardized parts delivered by a logistics network that functioned with assembly line precision. This was not weakness. This was strength of a kind Japan had no framework to understand. By 1944, the air war in the Pacific was effectively over. Japan still had aircraft, still had pilots, but they were shadows. The new pilots arriving at forward bases had perhaps 30 hours of flight time, trained on obsolete aircraft with insufficient fuel, their instructors dead or reassigned to suicide units. They faced Americans who had hundreds of hours, who flew aircraft like the P-38, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the F-6F Hellcat, machines designed not in desperation, but in calculated response to lessons learned. The kill ratios, once 12-1 in Japan's favor, reversed and worsened. By the Philippines campaign, American pilots were achieving 20-1 kill ratios. By Okinawa, it was higher. The Lightning itself evolved. The P-38J and P-38L models addressed earlier shortcomings, adding dive flaps to control compressibility, upgraded engines for better performance, increased fuel capacity for even greater range. In Europe, the P-38 struggled against the cold and the high-altitude performance of German fighters. But in the Pacific, it thrived. It flew top cover for bombers, conducted long-range reconnaissance, strafed ground targets, and hunted Japanese aircraft with methodical efficiency. And the Japanese pilots who survived understood, even if their leaders could not admit it, that they had been wrong. The Americans were not inferior. Their fighters were not inferior. The entire calculus of the war had been based on a fantasy, a belief that will and tradition could overcome mathematics and machinery. Some of the Japanese accounts written after the war carry a tone of almost philosophical resignation. They describe the moment they realized the war was lost, and often that moment involved an encounter with American aircraft, not a single catastrophic battle, but the cumulative weight of seeing the sky fill with enemy machines, of watching comrades fall, of returning to bases that were bombed and strafed until nothing remained but craters and burned wreckage. Lieutenant Yasuo Kuwahara, a kamikaze pilot who survived the war, wrote in his memoir of seeing a formation of P-38 Lightnings passing overhead at high altitude, their contrails white against the blue, untouchable, serene. He described the feeling not as anger, but as a kind of awe, the recognition that he was witnessing power on a scale he had not imagined possible. They flew, he wrote, as if the sky belonged to them, and it did. The P-38 Lightning flew its last combat missions in August 1945. By then, Japan's air forces were finished, its cities burned, its industry shattered. The atomic bombs fell, and the war ended, and the men who had flown the Lightning came home. They brought with them stories of a machine that had been difficult, demanding, sometimes frustrating, but ultimately victorious. They had flown it across jungles and oceans, through tropical storms and enemy fire, and it had brought them home. They had seen it kill the best pilots the enemy had, not through luck or even skill, but through the remorseless application of superior technology. In the decades after, historians would debate the reasons for Japan's defeat. Some would point to the destruction of the carrier fleet at Midway, others to the attrition of Guadalcanal. still others to the submarine blockade that strangled the home islands. All of these were true, but beneath them ran a simpler truth, one visible in the lines of a P-38 Lightning, that Japan had entered a war it could not win because it had misunderstood the enemy. It had believed American fighters were inferior because it had believed American civilization was inferior, and that belief was not merely wrong, but fatally so. The Lightning was not invincible. It had flaws, weaknesses, days when engines failed and pilots died, and missions ended in failure. But it was the product of a system that could learn, adapt, and outproduce any rival. It was built by democracy, that messy, inefficient, argumentative form of government that the Japanese militarists had dismissed as weak. And it was flown by citizens who were not warriors by tradition, but by necessity. Men who wanted to go home, but were willing to fight as long as required. And so, the P-38 Lightning became more than an aircraft. It became a symbol of what industrial democracy could achieve when fully mobilized. It became the answer to the question the Japanese had never thought to ask: what happens when a nation with limitless resources, technological sophistication, and the will to win focuses all of that power on a single objective? The answer screamed down from the Pacific sky at 400 miles per hour. Twin engines roaring, guns blazing, flown by men who had learned to master a machine that their enemy could neither match nor counter. The answer was written in the wreckage of Zeros scattered across 1,000 islands, in the empty chairs at Japanese air bases, in the silence that settled over the Pacific as the last of the Imperial Navy's great pilots fell burning into the sea. The Japanese leaders had believed American fighters were inferior. The P-38 Lightning taught them otherwise. It taught them with fire and thunder, with speed and steel, with the cold logic of engineering and the hot fury of combat. It taught them until there was nothing left to teach, until the lesson was written in blood and smoke across the sky, until the war ended and the survivors could count the cost of their miscalculation. And in the end, the lesson was this: that belief, no matter how deeply held, cannot withstand reality. That tradition, no matter how honored, cannot defeat technology. That the warrior's spirit, no matter how fierce, cannot overcome the factory's output. The P-38. Lightning did not win the Pacific War alone, but it was the instrument through which these truths were delivered, the messenger of an industrial power that Japan had failed to comprehend until it was too late. The sky belonged to America. The Lightning made it so,